Today I'll be analyzing a chess game I played against RudramurthySA. So it started with King's Pawn, and then I used the Vienna game by moving my knight up. Then he used his knight to attack the pawn, but now I moved my bishop's pawn up, attacking his pawn, and he took it, which is actually a mistake, because I can move my pawn forward, and now when his knight has nowhere to move because these are taken up by my knight, and these are taken up by my queen over here. So he's forced to move his knight back, which makes me up in development. So I just moved my bishop up, maybe threatening this f7 pawn for future attacks. And he decides to interestingly move his queen up. And the only real thing I see that this does is attacking this middle pawn and getting a check. So I decide to defend that pawn with my knight. And now he decides to attack it, creating two attackers on that pawn. So I just defend it. And this defend comes with the added bonus of taking this free pawn with my bishop. And instead of defending that pawn, he decides to just attack this middle pawn again. So now I take this pawn with my bishop and defend this middle pawn yet again. So now he creates a weaker fork on my pawn and my bishop, so I have to take with my pawn. So he just creates a different pin using my knight on my queen. But instead of just defending with this pawn and kicking him out that way, I decided to go the queen up. And this is useful because it keeps more defenses on this middle pawn, as well as what happened in the game, which is him taking my knight and then my queen taking back. So then he decided to castle because it gives him opportunities on the d file, and also moves his king a little bit more to safety. Now I decided to just check him to see what he does, maybe open up some opportunities, and he moves his queen to the side blocking and offering a queen trade. But I don't really like the idea because then I'll be behind in development, so I just move my pawn forward, which threatens his queen defended by both my light squared bishop and my queen. So he just moves his queen to the side, which maintains a pin on my king with the pawn. So I cannot take this pawn or else it'll be check. Now I just castle because I didn't like that pin that he put on me, and it also saves my king from a lot of trouble. And he just decides to do this, which, as you can see by this bar, isn't that good of a move, because you're basically just wasting your move, as now I could just take this without any problem. One thing it does do is, if I took this earlier, it would be a check as well as threatening the knight, versus now with this king away, it's not a check. But I just take it anyway, and now my bishop defends it, and the only attacker on this pawn is the queen, and he's not going to do that trade. So instead, he moves his knight out of the way, so my pawn cannot take. And he's also attacking my queen now. So I just move my queen up, which maintains an attack on this g7 pawn. And also, I'm looking for opportunities on this side for maybe a checkmate. So he just decides to kick me out by moving his pawn to h6. And I do what I said earlier, which is move my queen over here. And now he moves his queen over here, which is really interesting because he's basically making a queen trade, because the only two ways I could block this are my rook, which would be okay, but he would queen trade himself anyway, or sacrificing my bishop, which isn't good. And the only other option is moving my king here, which isn't that good in the first place. So I just take his queen. And he just takes back with my bishop, creating check again. And at this point, I really didn't want to sacrifice my rook or my bishop, so I just moved my king to the side. And now he moves the bishop back, offering a bishop trade. And I didn't really like this bishop's position anyway, so I just did the trade. And he took with the rook to maintain his power over the d file. And now I move my a rook into the game because it was sort of off to the side the entire game. And he decides to attack this bishop, which is okay for him, but it just got my bishop to stop defending this pawn over here. And I moved it forward, and he just kicked it out immediately, so I moved it backwards. And this is defended by this pawn over here, so his rook cannot take. And now he decides to attack this pawn over here, because obviously he just kicked out my bishop from defending it. So the only real way I see to defend this is to move my e rook up. So that's what I do. And now he offers this trade, which is moving the rook here. And I see that this isn't that bad, because after I take, he's forced to take with the knight. And now my rook is still defending this f rook that was blocked by the knight earlier. So now I move my knight here, which the bar says isn't that good, but my strategy was just to move my knight forward over here to protect the pawn one more time. And that's when he makes this mistake of moving the king to the side, because now that just reinforces the idea of me doing what I do next, which is the knight, because now it comes with a check. And instead of him doing something like this, threatening my knight to get out of there, he decides to move his king to the side, which isn't that bad because you could still do that move over here, but it could have been better to do the other option. Now I just decide to do another defender on that pawn with the bishop, and he moves his knight over here, blocking my rook. So it's not a defender anymore, but that doesn't really matter because if the rook takes, I still have 2 more attackers. So I decide to move my rook up here, and the reason is because I'm trying to pick off his weak knight over here. And he decides to move his king, attacking my knight. And I actually take this trade, because as you can see, I can now take these pawns up here, which I do. And the interesting thing is if he moved up here, trying to take my pawn, I could just give him a check, and then he has to like move out of the way, and this isn't that good for him. So instead, he goes straight for my bishop, because he sees there's no defenders. And I take this pawn anyway to try to defend that pawn. And he keeps on going for my bishop, and I start pushing the second pawn, because the idea is that if I could get this pawn all the way up here to the end area, he's going to have too much pressure on both sides. And by the way, I'm sort of down on time right now, which is why I didn't move it 2 spaces up instead of 1. That was just a mistake. But after this, he threatens my bishop fully now, and I'm forced to move it out of the way. And this isn't that bad because he still cannot take with his rook, or else I'll just take with mine. So instead, he goes with his pawn forward, which is, I'm assuming, to try to kick my bishop out, or my pawn structure will be damaged. But I just stop that with the bishop, as well as defending this pawn yet again. So at this point, he just moves this rook over here, which at first looks sort of bad because you're stopping the attack on this pawn, but it's actually threatening a checkmate over here because of my bad king position. But I see this, so I move my g-pawn forward to make an escape route over here. And he goes for the check anyway, and that's not that good for him because I could just do this, and he just checks again, and I go down, and then it's sort of useless in the end. Then I just keep on pushing my pawn because of my idea of getting double pressure on both sides. Next, he's trying to threaten this pawn again, I assume, with this king, and I just keep on pushing. So I'm just trying to get that pawn to the end, and at this point, he decides to block with this knight, which isn't that good because the king cannot take because I have this bishop protecting the pawn anyway. So after I push this pawn yet again, he just moves back. And now I just make this move to check the king, which he just decides to resign here. And I'm assuming it's because he just saw the double pressure and his king was getting moved away from the pawn now, so he just resigned at this point. And that's how I beat RudramurthySA.